Welcome to our live webinar for RAP Week, and it is hosted by Lisa Thompson, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation's Vice President of Education and Outreach.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're really glad for this opportunity with RAP Week to be able to share with you about the issue of pornography and its impacts on culture. So we're going to just dive right into a talk today that I've titled Hate plus Apathy plus Sex plus Technology, a discussion about pornography, history, culture, and the end of love. So, as Haley mentioned, this presentation is being brought to you by the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. We operate in Washington, D.C., and we are really focused on the issue of sexual justice. We want to bring sexual justice to our world, and we're working to build a culture that will promote that will be working to end sexual violence and objectification and exploitation. And we are part with many other organizations of the effort to do that, but we're glad to be at the heart of that movement. So with that, let's go forward one more slide. Haley, I have a feeling that's too washed out. So we're going to make some adjustments so that folks can maybe see this better. Not really sure. We want to be sure you can make out the presentation. Okay, what do you think? Move it forward, move that forward? Okay. There we go. Hopefully this will be clear. It's a little challenging to get all these things set up, but I think this will be better. Okay. So before I start, I want to say a special thanks to some really amazing women who have helped me a lot over the years as I've been learning about this issue, who've contributed greatly to my education on the subject, and they include Dr. Judith Reisman. Some of you out there will be familiar with Judith and her incredible work. She's particularly been a relentless champion in researching the history of Al Kinsey and the work that he did and how that has negatively impacted our society. Dr. Diana Russell, who's done a lot of work on the issue of pornography and exploitation, and then of course Dr. Dale Gines, one of the really preeminent experts on pornography in the world today. So my hat's off to them. Thank you, ladies, and let's go forward. So just a broad outline of what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk about the things that shape our sexuality very briefly. I want us to think about what has gone into shaping our own individual sexuality. And then we're going to look at our culture, how it's become pornified, what that looks like, break it down, what are the messages that are coming through the pornified culture that we live in, and then we're going to take a step back, roll back in time, and figure out how it became that way. Look at some of the history about what brought us to this point. We'll also have a discussion about what modern pornography looks like. Just very much skimming the surface. We're not going to be diving into the depths of what's out there, but giving you some of the unfortunate mainstream kind of themes that you'll find in pornography today and what that means for us, how that impacts our culture. And then we're going to look at what that means for the long term. Does it mean an end of love? Could that be in the offing for future generations? And so with that, let's just move on in. Okay, so before I get really move deeper into the conversation, let's outline some things and make some points so that you won't be confused as we move through this. One, we're going to be talking about pornography as men possessing women in a historical context. So to the degree that we're looking at the historical development of pornography, it's very much a product that was by men and for men. So this is not to say that women aren't involved in the production of pornography and women aren't consumers of pornography, but as it's developed over time, it very much something that was fomented by men, and I think overwhelmingly still is. So we'll be talking about it from that perspective. Also, this isn't intended to be male bashing. We're not here to say we hate men or anything like that, even though by and large the vast majority of people who use pornography are men. This is much more it's just the fact, and it's a sad fact, and in fact we have a great deal of compassion for the men who are caught up and find themselves trapped as addicted to the pornography industry. So, but this is not male bashing. Also, we recognize that not all men who consume pornography go out and become rapists or child molesters, but I do think it definitely shapes their sexual appetites, their sexual template, and has a negative impact on them. So it's not that there aren't outcomes for all individuals who use pornography, but they don't all go to the extreme behaviors that some end up participating in. We do recognize that increasingly women are involved in the consumption of pornography, but this talk, I think it'll be helpful to anybody who's currently engaged in using pornography, or even if you're not using pornography, to help you gain a better understanding about what is going on in pornography today. What are its messages? What is it telling society? How is it shaping us? So, yeah, and then we're going to just kind of be getting a snapshot of again, skimming the surface of some of the stuff that's in pornography. This isn't meant to be some in-depth analysis. It's really a snapshot. And then this is not going to be a discussion that's going to go deep into statistics or into the solutions. It's really just meant to present, hey, this is what we're seeing as the outgrowth of pornography. And really it's going to be talking about pornography, framing it as a form of propaganda. What is that propaganda and what is it saying? Okay. Now, unfortunately, pornography, it's an ugly, dirty, nasty thing. And it's really hard to talk about it without participating in that to at least some extent. So I apologize in advance for anything offensive that you might find in here. I've gone to great lengths to try to minimize the potential visual impact and the messaging in here, but it's really impossible to convey the scope of what's happening, the truth of what's happening, without it somewhat participating in it. So it's going to be indecent at times. And I'll try to give you warnings as the more graphic material is upcoming. Okay. So I want to spend some time talking about key terms, and then we've kind of reviewed this already, so we'll skip forward. We'll go forward. Okay. Now, if you'll recall the title of this presentation, I use the word hate in the title, and I think this is a really important thing that we need to consider. Gail Gines has talked about how modern pornography is really about making hate. And guess what? We can't see the screen at all. It's completely washed out. Oh, okay. Let's see. I don't know what we can do. I do not know. Can't see a thing. Can I move this? I'm just wondering if I bring it closer. Hi, live. Ah, there. Except now I get my shadow. Okay. What can we do, folks? Sorry, everybody. I know this is frustrating for you. Believe me, it's frustrating for us, too. We've even practiced this, and you just don't know. Can't always get all the bugs worked out ahead of time. Where did it go? Huh. It was, oh, I'm almost seeing it. What's the deal? We're trying more things.
Is that good? Almost. Do you want to go a little further?
Yeah. go a little
And then you
further.
can just stand
Okay.
over on the side. Oh,
Oh, like,
starting to get it?
how's it look? Can you see it, Christina?
Mm-mm.
We've got 5 viewers. Thank you for being patient. I sincerely apologize. All right, well, we'll keep messing around a little bit here. But let me just say, shoot, why is that so? Okay, yeah. The thing I wanted to do here was throw out some, I'm going to just stand off to the side because let me tell you, it's really annoying seeing yourself give a talk. So I'm going to move off. Okay. The thing that I wanted to do was present some terms that we bandy about so commonly that I think sometimes we don't even think about what they mean anymore. And one of those terms I wanted to talk about was the word hate. And as I mentioned just a few moments ago, Gail Dines talks about modern pornography as, quote, making hate. So the definition that I have up here from Merriam-Webster talks about hate as being an intense hostility and aversion deriving from fear, anger, or a sense of injury. It also talks about hate as an extreme dislike or even a loathing. And I would like you to keep those ideas in mind, especially when we get into the part of the presentation where I am sharing with you some of the modern types of pornography. What do you see as its character? Does it look like love, or does it look like hate? Do you see extreme dislike? Do you see loathing? Be on the watch for that as we move through the presentation. Next. Oh. Okay. Now, another word I wanted to talk about today is the word apathy, because I think this is also deeply connected with the issue that we're dealing with. A lot of people just don't seem to care. And so in the word apathy, we're talking about a lack of feeling or emotion, a lack of interest or concern, and even indifference. And why is that important? I think it's important because you see signs of this. It's really an imprint over most pornography that's out there. There is a lack of feeling, a lack of emotion, a lack of caring and concern, a mutuality among the people who are involved in performing pornography. And I think this is very key because people who are using pornography as sexual stimulus are seeing this lack of concern. They're seeing this apathy towards the other individual in it, and that's shaping their sexual appetites as well. All right. Another word that we want to consider is the word power. And particularly as you probably won't be able to see this, but power as the idea of possession, of control, authority, or influence over others. And this is another thing that I think you'll see manifest in modern types of pornography. There's someone who's in the dominant position of control, who's exerting authority and influence over others. And so when we get into the section of this presentation that deals with modern forms of pornography, I want you to think about who is it that has the power? Who is it that's in control? And then last but not least, well, actually it's not last, it's almost last, next to last, love. This is a really important concept for us because I think we're at this tipping point in our society where people are starting to not believe in love, where they're starting to believe that, especially as pertains to sexuality or intimate human relationships, young people are beginning to say they don't believe love exists. They think it's a fantasy. They think it's just something, maybe it existed in the past, but they don't believe it's possible for themselves. But when I'm talking about love, I'm talking about the idea of a attachment to another person, a warm and deep attachment, even a sense of devotion, where another being becomes even your beloved, where there's an unselfish loyalty towards the other person, and you are concerned for the other's good and well-being. And this is something that I think, again, is key to our discussion about pornography because it's so void of any manifestation of these ideas. Now, here we are. Last setup term I wanted to present to you all is the idea of propaganda. I am really convinced, and I'm not the one who came up with this idea, there's others before me who have said it as well, that pornography is a type of propaganda. And what does propaganda do? What is it? Well, it's basically biased information that's used to shape opinion and behavior. And you can identify it by certain traits. And this particular slide is from a leaflet from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And it was talking about propaganda in terms of Nazi propaganda. And here's what they were saying, that propaganda has certain traits where it uses truths and half-truths or outright lies, and it combines them together. It omits information selectively. It simplifies complex issues or ideas, plays on emotions, advertises a cause, attacks opponents, and targets desired audiences. And again, I just want to encourage you as we move through this presentation that you hold these ideas in your mind. Be thinking about the concept of hate, of loathing an individual. Do you see that in porn? Do you see these ideas of, is pornography emitting information? Is it playing on certain emotions? Who's it attacking? Do you see any of these hallmarks in porn? Okay. So, as I've already articulated, I'm convinced that pornography is a form of propaganda, that it equals propaganda. And in this way, it's actually a systematic attempt, I would argue, mostly by men, to control attitudes about women and actually get us in our own exploitation, that pornography encourages fear and anger. It certainly perpetuates anger women, and it discourages ideals of equality and mutual respect. Okay, now we've talked about the Holocaust Museum, talked about some of the aspects or characteristics of propaganda. We can also see that that propaganda uses stereotypes. It uses name substitution, so the individual's name is not actually used. They're called certain names, and they repeat these themes over and over. There might be lying. So these are some of the techniques, quote, of persuasion that are used in pornography. Now, I'm not going to review all these different techniques of persuasion as they pertain to pornography today, but what I want to give you an example of is this idea of name substitution and repetition. So as pertains to pornography, these are just a few selections of some titles, and you see very quickly that the idea of women, or actually an individual, is quickly replaced by the idea of whore. And it's repeated over and over, from filthy whore, super whore, cum-swallowing whore, super whore, daddy's little whore, you name it, women are whores. And so this is an example of name substitution, it's an example of lying, and it's an example of the immense repetitive refrain that you hear in pornography over and over. Now, all this propaganda results in a dehumanization of the other. It allows the consumer of pornography to perceive the other, the person that they're using, as subhuman, as even non-human, as though they're just inanimate items that are dispensable, that are really irrelevant. They don't have a humanity. This is the upshot of what all this propaganda ultimately does. So when this happens, when this process of dehumanization happens, the maltreatment of individuals and their destruction may be carried out or acquiesced in with relative freedom from the restraints of conscience or feelings or of brotherhood. Now, one more thing before we get into the more substantive parts of this presentation. I want to plant the seed in your mind of the fact that for folks who consume pornography, that this is a practice run in their minds, that pornography is really rehearsal. It's not devoid of meaning. I know one of the things you hear often is that pornography is just fantasy, so therefore it's harmless. Well, I really reject the idea that pornography is just fantasy. For one reason, there's very real masturbation and orgasm happening for every person who is using pornography. That's not a fantasy, that is real. Now, there might be particular things going on in the minds of the individuals who are engaging in that activity, and to the degree that that's happening, they are practicing, they are rehearsing in their minds what they're seeing portrayed before them. And so, as Furter and Hegel have pointed out, sexual fantasy is rehearsal for relationships. And if you image others as mere instruments of your gratification, you are literally rehearsing exploitive patterns of behavior towards others. And the more that you picture yourself either using others or being used, the more such encounters will feel familiar or normal. So this is an important point, because pornography is basically helping people to think that this way of using other people is what's normal, and that the sexual encounters that they're seeing depicted are what is real. Okay, so let's talk about the types of things that shape our sexuality. Of course, there's modeling by our parents. Maybe we get, our sexuality might be influenced by our religious beliefs, but then we have a whole sea of things surrounding us that are also increasingly playing into what shapes our sexuality. So it can, the cultural values that surround us, the media that we consume, and of course that media might include pornography. So I think, though, it would be interesting to ask yourself the question, can you imagine your sexuality without pornography? Now, for the younger generation, I think this is going to become a harder and harder exercise, because we're getting to a point where there's nearly ubiquitous exposure to pornography. We know that children are being exposed at very young ages, oftentimes starting around 10 or 11 years old, might be their first exposure. And now with the advent of the internet and the accessibility of pornography, it's easy to assume that they're going to be, absorbing more and more content. It's not just a one-off exposure. They're going to be having repeated exposure. And besides that, they're living in this kind of pornified world that we have created that didn't exist, say, 30 years ago. So I think we're living in a time where it's really hard for people to imagine what would their sexuality look like if it hadn't been informed by pornography. So just mull that over in your mind. And, everybody's answer is going to be different. Everybody's level of exposure will be different. And the types of things that they might have been exposed to will be different. But from whether it's pornography or the sexualized media around us, the fact is that we're all getting a lot of input from outside influences into our sexuality. And I'm wondering, wouldn't it be fun to be free of that? That's my idea anyway. They would be really, what kind of opportunities are we missing in our sexuality because we've been so programmed by what society and the culture is telling us? Okay, so I've mentioned the fact that we live in this pornified culture. I don't think anybody would really argue with me on this point. We see signs of it really literally all around us, from the hypersexualization of somebody like Kim Kardashian to film debuts like 50 Shades of Grey, Sports Illustrated constantly pushing the boundaries with their swimsuit edition, and advertising that normalizes depictions of sexual violence. This is really all around us, from the people who, we see on our TV shows who engage in like pornographic photo shoots, to advertising, to film, to music, to sports. It's out there. We're surrounded. And I would say that we're actually in a soft porn culture, that we've been porned. We're living the soft porn culture. Now, I'm not the only one who's saying this, and we've been seeing this trend coming for quite a while. And in as far back as like 2005, there was a really great book called Female Chauvinist Pigs, and in it there's a quote from Judith Reagan. Now, why is this important? Well, she was the publisher of the book by Jenna Jameson. Now, Jenna Jameson, in case any of you don't know, is one of the more famous pornography performers, particularly of the last decade. And in it, anyway, Jenna wrote a book, and Judith was her publisher. And here's what Judith said. She says, "I believe there's a pornization of the culture. What that means is that if you watch every single thing that's going on out there in popular culture, you will see females scantily clad, implanted, dressed up like hookers, porn stars, and so on, and that it's very acceptable." And that was 10 years ago. And if anything, that's on the increase. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind about all this pornified culture is, you know, a lot of people tell us it's progressive. A lot of people tell us that this is a sign of empowerment, but don't buy that. At its heart, this is a commercial enterprise. This is people using our sexuality to try to sell us stuff. So as Ariel Levy says in her book, Female Chauvinist Pigs, raunch culture is not essentially progressive, it's essentially commercial. And you see that all the time, whether it's from a Carl Jr.'s ad, like the one that just came out a month or two ago, to supposedly selling, this is supposedly an ad for jeans by, I think it's Alex Wang. I don't even know who the guy is, a fashion designer, selling his denim with a stripped woman. And to things like pimp juice or T-shirts that are very blatant in their promotion of a porn culture. And then we've got the advent of things like these so-called bikini baristas. We can't even get a cup of coffee now without it being sexualized. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this phenomenon, this is something that is going on out in the Pacific Northwest, but it's starting to spread to different parts of the country, where you have so-called coffee shops in which women who are dressed essentially like strippers are serving up your coffee. And it's just never ceases to amaze me, the range of things that will be sexualized. So whether it's cigars, whether it's the local bowling alley, or whether it's your toilet paper. Yes, people, this is an ad for toilet paper. Who knew your toilet paper could be so sexy? Like, really. And now things like Halloween costumes. So this one is for an adult woman. This one is for your 11-year-old, so she can be a sexy pirate, because that's important when you're 11. Okay, so keep that in your mind, that what's happening to our world is that this pornification has a monetary component behind it, and that is the principal overarching reason why it's going on. But in addition, now we're really going to move into this idea of the propaganda aspect, and what the propaganda aspect of the pornography industry is doing, how it's impacting our culture in terms of a homogenization of the beauty ideal and what it means to be female. So in this frame, what we see is that the all pornography, all the time mentality is everywhere in today's culture, not just in cybersex and Playboy magazine. So it's everywhere, but it's telling women, all female, that to be powerful, to be meaningful, to be important, or to be beautiful, you must be sexy. And of course, a great example of how we're constantly dished up this message on a monthly basis would be Cosmopolitan. And they routinely, present us women scantily clad, and telling us, that there's nothing more important than that we learn the next new sex position, and that we be hot and available at all times. You also see, this is one of the more creepy examples of homogenization I've seen out there, but you get this idea of how the long hair, the long lithe bodies, a slightly bronzed, glazed look, and in fact, in this particular ad, I would say the zombification of women as a beauty ideal. And this is what we're perpetually telling women and young girls that they need to aspire to. Now, of course, it doesn't go to such extremes in all cases, but I think there's something very intriguing if we take the case of Heidi Montag. Now, some of you might be familiar with the fact that she was on an MTV show called The Hills. And we saw her transformation over a period of time from this beautiful young woman in 2006, just lovely, to someone who's very plasticized and I would say pornified. Now, and I share this with regret and a heavy heart. I am not attacking Heidi Montag, but I think she personifies an extreme end of the spectrum of what is happening to young women and girls if they really buy into fully into what the society is telling them, and the power of the pornified messages that are out there, that they must conform, that they must meet the pornified beauty ideal. Now, she, in addition to being on the show The Hills, she is noted for having undergone 10 plastic surgeries in one day. 10 cosmetic procedures in one day. So again, extreme example, but a sad one of what can happen with this homogenization effect. And you see evidence of this beyond people. It's not just Heidi. There are many other people who are feeling the need that they must meet the beauty ideal. And as reported by the American Society of Aesthetic and Plastic Surgery, they had seen in 10 years' time, this was back in 2009, a 465% increase in the total number of cosmetic procedures. So they had gone to over 12 million procedures occurring annually for things like liposuction, facelifts, or what they call the bionic package. So that included things like tummy tucks and breast jobs and facial rejuvenation. So again, a clear sign of the power of the need for women to conform to the homogenized beauty ideal. And I decided to look up to try to find some more current information. And so from the 2013 Plastic Surgery Statistics Report, we see that breast augmentation is up 37% from the year 2000. Breast lifts are up 70%. Buttock lifts are up 80%, thigh lifts 64%, and the upper arm lift, because that's ever so important, 4,565% since the year 2000. Now we're up to more than 15.1 million cosmetic procedures a year, and nearly 91% of all cosmetic procedures are done on females. So if we needed some proof in the pudding, there you have it. Now, in addition to a homogenized beauty ideal that we see as part of the pornified messaging that we're all breathing in, is the idea that women are basically in a constant perpetual state of heat. It doesn't matter where we go, what we wear, what we're doing, we're ready for it, supposedly, according to the advertising. So here we have, Scarlett Johansson, clearly ready for a moment of amorous bliss. Beyonce, Rihanna. So we could spend an hour just with examples of that. Now, so in addition to the idea of women constantly being in a mood to have sex, we continually see sexualization of children. Now, this is a picture of Miley Cyrus from 2009. This is a few years back. And in this particular episode, now at this time, she was only about 16, 17 years old. And the ice cream cart is neatly equipped with a stripper pole. So she can grind and move around a stripper pole as a teenage girl. Additional ways in we see the signs of sexualization of children, things like thong underwear for girls, or little halter bra type tops for toddlers, because yeah, they have boobs, not, but because of the age compression and marketers trying to sell them sexy things. These series of photos appeared in a French Vogue. I think they're some of the creepiest things I've seen of, sexualization of children, and really the age compression that's going on, pushing the the age is lower and lower, and basically dressing up these girls like adults, giving them this pouty, sexy look, and we wonder why sexual abuse happens. Really, when we're portraying our children in this kind of way. Now, I'm not going to actually play this clip, but we see some hypersexualization of children in things like the dancing world. And so this particular dance routine aired a few years back, and it got a lot of media attention at the time. But essentially, these girls are dressed up like strippers, and they do this very sexualized dance routine, and all the while to a cheering audience of adoring fans. One has to wonder what these people are thinking. How could this possibly be appropriate for 9, 10, 11-year-old girls? I'm not going to show this clip either in the interest of time, because we did lose quite a bit of time at the beginning here. But this is of a cheerleading high school dance team, or a high school dance team from Jonesboro, Georgia, which back in 2009 decided that it would be appropriate to do a routine in which they had men or young boys from the audience come and sit in chairs while they did a stripper-esque type dance around them in the middle of the gym floor. So this was 2009, and so we're several years down the road from that. But these are just the examples abound of how our children are being sexualized. So we have the homogenation of the beauty ideal. We have the idea that women are constantly in a state of, ready to have sex, just when and wherever. We see the sexualization of children, and also we see signs of male sexual power. A lot of times, the way women are depicted, it's to enhance the idea of male sexual power. And these are two great examples. And if the folks who are watching, if you were here, I'd love if we could have a conversation about it. But since we can't, I'll just tell you what some of the things that often come up. Sometimes I ask people, who do you think has the most power of these two pictures? Is it this fellow over here, or is it Tony from The Sopranos? And there's usually some interesting conversation that ensues, and a lot of people feel like, well, this fella here, some actor guy, I should know his name, but I don't, that he has the most power because he's so powerful, he can have 2 naked women lounging around him seductively. But others think that no, Tony has more power in this depiction because this woman, we don't even get to see her face. She remains anonymous. She is nobody. Whereas at least in these pictures, we see the faces of the women. We know they have an identity. So it's an interesting discussion that can be had. We also see increasingly depictions of sexual violence in various forms. So one example would be like from Dolce & Gabbana ad, which is essentially sexualizing gang rape. Here we have a Calvin Klein jeans ad. Again, the same thing, sexualizing gang rape. And this goes back all the way to 2006, where America's Next Top Model did an episode in which the models were all depicted as dead and murdered in various fashions. So we're seeing themes of male power and sexual violence and just general violence against women. Here's more from the America's Top Model shoot. Again, in this particular series, you see the women are glamorized. They're wearing evening gowns. They're beautifully dressed. So we have this sexualization of their homicide. A more recent example, interestingly, we have Miley with more clothes on than usual. But she's posed with a corpse. In this depiction, this is an interesting depiction. There's clearly been violence going on here, brutal violence, but I'm intrigued that the woman is presented in the most vulnerable, but she's not dead, but she's clearly vulnerable, right? She's the one who's naked, who's exposed to the group of men. So again, it's in this way we're sexualizing the violence that's depicted here. Now, ironically, we're told that all this sexiness and the way that, portraying women this way, that it actually equals female power. And you see so many women of Hollywood participating in this messaging and buying into the idea that for them to be powerful women, for them to be culturally influenced, to be cultural influencers, that they need to participate in this pornified culture. From everybody from Nicole Kidman, Jennifer Aniston, Katy Perry, there's very few who don't participate. Now, and of course, I would argue that at the apex of this, the supreme quintessential example of what can happen to someone in Hollywood who gets caught up in all who buys into what Hollywood is telling, is buying into what our pornified culture says, would be Miley Cyrus. And I find this so heartbreaking that we could see this beautiful young teenage girl who becomes this young woman. And we all know she's completely out of control, that this is not symbolic of power, of control, of empowerment, that this is symbolic of a person who's very deeply wounded and broken and is, I think, crying out for help. But she is completely bought into the messaging that has surrounded her and has influenced her from the time that she was a child. Okay, so we've taken a look at the messages that we see in what I would call the soft porn culture that we all imbibe every day. But it didn't used to be this way, and I think it's important for our younger generation to know that. I happen to be old enough to have lived in a time where, yeah, we had sexualized things that were around us, but nothing like this. We could still had much greater access to porn-free environments, pornified-free environments. So, but how did this all happen? It didn't happen overnight. It's something that happened over time. So let's take a look at that. So as Dr. Judith Reisman has done a tremendous amount of work researching and showing, a lot of this can be traced back to, its early roots can go back to Al Kinsey. So Kinsey began teaching a so-called marriage course in 1938 at Indiana University. And as a part of his course, he exposed students to pornography and urged them to experiment with masturbation. Now, this is in 1938 when sexual mores were a lot different than they are now. So I find it absolutely astounding that this was allowed to happen and that it did happen, but it did. And Kinsey would insist that his students measure and then reveal to him the size of their sexual organs. Now, even today, it's pretty hard for me to imagine somebody, a professor in one of my college classes, telling me to measure the size of my sexual organs and report it to him. But this is what Kinsey did, and this became the basis. This is what launched him into so-called sexology research. So you move forward, he continues doing this over time and building up a portfolio of information about what students reported to him. And eventually he launches in 1947 at Indiana University, the Institute for Sex Research. And he had a couple of significant partners, Wardell Pomeroy and Clyde Martin. And so this is a picture of the guys in 1948. Now, over that period of time, from the 30s until 48, they had been working on collecting stories and collecting information, which they ultimately compiled into a book called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, which was released in 1948. So, and then later in 1953, Kinsey comes out with Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. And both of these were published to wide acclaim. That it was just, everybody thought these were the best things since sliced bread, that this was really kind of blowing the cover off of American sexuality and telling the truth about what Americans did sexually. So it was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, these so-called sex studies. And the 2 volumes were based on 18,000 sexual histories that the men had collected. Now, the supposed findings of Kinsey's research were that more than 90% of American males masturbated, that more than 70% had purchased sex from someone in prostitution. And that one is just, it's crazy. It's definitely not, the highest percentages I've ever seen about men purchasing sex in America come nowhere close to this. So really exaggerated number there. That as many as 45% of males had extramarital intercourse, that 37% of American males had at least one homosexual encounter, and that 10% of males were more or less exclusively homosexual. Now, you need to keep in mind that he's collecting this data from the late 30s through the 40s. So, does this sound like American culture to you in that time frame? Now, the problems with there's several problems with Kinsey's methodology. First of all, the collection method. So, go back, please. He used what's referred to as opportunistic collection. So he chose his subjects not at random, but as opportunity presented themselves. And he was relying on the sheer size of his data to supposedly create a representative sample. But what happened is there was overrepresentation of so-called delinquent and non-delinquent subgroups. And so this is really had a strong influence on the outcome of his data, because he was going to prisons, he was going to gay bathhouses, and not in any way coming up with a true representative sample for his data collection. And so, as has been reported by many people, his methodology and sampling technique virtually guaranteed that he was find what he was looking for. And so, in addition to the problem with the sampling method and the real hogwash that it all amounted to, is you have extreme normalization of child sexual abuse in his book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. So it contains a chapter on the early sexual growth and activity of boys, in which their orgasms are described in detail. And astoundingly, I mean, it's gaspingly shocking that this happened, but the chapter is based almost entirely on the reminiscences of a man who claimed to have engaged in sex with 600 pre-adolescent boys and 200 pre-adolescent girls. So we're talking about a serial child molester on the mammoth proportions, and that data from this man is woven into Kinsey's book, and that this is reported as science. So I want to share with you, I'm going to read an excerpt now from Kinsey's book. So let's see if I can show you. So here's the book. You can see the spine there, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. I'm on page 177. So just to give you a sampling of what Kinsey reported as science. Orgasm has been observed in boys of every age from 5 months to adolescence. See table 31. Orgasm in our records for a female babe of 4 months. The orgasm in an infant or other young male is, except for lack of ejaculation, a striking duplicate of orgasm in an older adult. As described earlier in this chapter, the behavior involves a series of gradual psychologic changes and the development of rhythmic body movements with distinct penis throbs and pelvic thrusts, an obvious change in sensory capacities, a final tension of muscles, especially of the abdomen, hips, and back, a sudden release with convulsions, including rhythmic anal contractions, followed by the disappearance of all symptoms. A fretful babe quiets down under the initial sexual stimulation, is distracted from other activities, begins rhythmic pelvic thrusts, becomes tense as climax approaches, is thrown into convulsive action, often with violent arm and leg movements, sometimes with weeping at the moment of climax. So, page 177 from Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. Thank you, Al Kinsey. So, as one commentator said, whatever the putative value to science of Mr. X's experiences, the fact remains that he was a predatory pedophile. Over the course of his long career as a child molester, he masturbated infants, penetrated children, and performed a variety of other sexual acts on pre-adolescent boys and girls alike. Betraying a huge moral blind spot, Kinsey took the records of Mr. X's criminal acts and transformed them into scientific data. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, Kinsey's report went on to wide acclaim and received lots of fanfare and media attention. So you see here he's featured on the cover of Time magazine. But the people who protested Kinsey were largely ignored. And I find it interesting that Abraham Maslow was one of the people who criticized Kinsey's work. And you might be familiar with him as the man who came up with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, but go Abraham Maslow. Now, another commentator on Kinsey said, it's virtually impossible to overstate the impact of the Kinsey reports, had on the American public. So it was a watershed moment, and from the time that these reports came out, we begin to see huge shifts in the way Americans think about sexuality and in the pornification of culture. So, not the least of which was with Hugh Hefner. So, in 1950, Hefner read Kinsey, and he was absolutely enthralled and intrigued by what Kinsey had to say. And he began calling himself Kinsey's pamphleteer. In other words, someone who was a prophet or, publicizing Kinsey's work. And ultimately, his aspirations, he had long desired to be in publishing and to produce a magazine. And his aspirations succeed in 1953 when he releases the publication Playboy. Now, Playboy, as most of us know, became the first popular gateway disseminator of mainstream pornography. And had we more time, I would show you this really intriguing interview with Hefner and William Buckley, but we'll skip that. Okay, now, from the first, from a 1956 issue of Playboy, we find this description of what it was that Hefner was proclamating. He says, what is a Playboy? He can be a sharp-minded business executive, a worker in the arts, a university professor, an architect, or an engineer. He can be many things, provided he possesses a certain kind of view. He must be an alert man, a man of taste, a man sensitive to pleasure, a man who, without acquiring the stigma of a voluptuary or dilettante, can live life to the hilt. So, I mean, this is the kind of ridiculous hogwash that he was throwing out there as what it meant to be a porn user. Okay, next. So, ultimately, he was selling a lifestyle. He was selling the idea that it was cool, hip, and suave to use his magazine to purchase pornography, and of course they had all kinds of advertising in it, and so he was really out to sell a product. And by helping to create this idea that by consuming Playboy you were part of this cool, hip, suave lifestyle, that was one of his main marketing strategies. And you can kind of see, different men in media who kind of personify the Playboy, the idea of the Playboy lifestyle, whether it's Cary Grant or George Clooney or Charlie Sheen. There are certain men, or particularly Sean Connery in his depictions of James Bond, These were people who were definitely giving us a real-life representation of the Playboy lifestyle. Now, I think this is a particularly helpful analysis of the Playboy lifestyle. It says, unfortunately, or given to us by Tony Campolo, Tony says, unfortunately, as he's looking at James Bond has become the model for far too many men in the Western world. Being cool or emotionally attached has become a trait that many men want to imitate. The problem with the James Bonds of the world is that they usually play at being cool for so long that they lose the capacity to ever be passionate. Passion requires that the individual surrender to the desires of his or her partner. And this is an important quote because James Bond was directly modeled off the personifications of the Playboy lifestyle. And so, of course, we know about the James Bond films and the very clear way in which they objectify women. And this was put forward in film as a cool lifestyle, as an example of the ultimate manhood. Now, other things we see in pornography here, like it's important to realize that in publications like Playboy, which most people consider to be mainstream pornography, we have a normalization of sexual violence occurring. So this is an example from 1977 of a cartoon that appeared in Playboy, in which basically what we're seeing depicted here is a woman who's been tied up, been molested, perhaps raped by someone who's broken into her home. And she happens to say, well, before you go, would you mind tightening my ankles a little? So the message being that women enjoy sexual assault, they enjoy rape, that they want more of it. And this is appearing in Playboy as far back as 1977. You have an ad which appeared in Playboy in 75, very much clearly normalizing child sexual abuse. And because the print here is very fine, I have it over here, so I'll read it for you. The headline reads, "How One Family Solved Its Discipline Problem." This is Jane. When she is nice, she's very, very nice. But when she is naughty, she has to be punished. Lately, Jane has been very, very naughty. That's why in the current issue of We magazine, Jane is pictured in a variety of poses that restrict her movement. So you see, it's for her own good and not, incidentally, your pleasure. So we have an extreme example of the normalization of child sexual abuse. We have the child being tied up and restrained, and that idea of being sexualized. More cartoons from Playboy. So this one is a girl outside of a bathhouse with a much older man saying, "You call that being molested?" as if she's dissatisfied with the molestation that just occurred. So these, and I'll skip a couple of the other ones. You see ways in which Playboy infantilized women, so they're helping to shape and frame men's sexual templates to prefer young, childlike women. They're infantilizing women and shaping their desires to seek children. Here you have the sexualized girl in the school uniform. A theme you see over and over in pornography: the sexualization of school children. Yep. Now, of course, Hefner was not to be outdone. What happened as a result of Hefner is that there was a huge onslaught of imitators who wanted to get in on what the success that he was having. Not the least of which was Bob Guccione, who came up with Penthouse. And in fact, Guccione was one of the main contenders because he pushed the envelope so far. He went places where Hefner had not been willing to go. Hefner was partly successful because he had sexualized the American girl next door. He tried to keep things on a somewhat fresh and innocent level, but Bob Guccione had no such sensitivities. And in fact, as reported by Lamont about Guccione on his death, he says, his legacy records him as a pioneer of printed pornography, one who shifted the boundaries of his industry in questionable taste. and succeeded, to borrow his phrase, in objectifying every body part of a woman save for her tonsils. So Guccione was very much about pushing the envelope and making pornography harder and harder. And then, of course, the next guy on the scene was Larry Flynt, who came out with the first issue of Hustler in 1974. Now, here's a scene from Hustler. It's called Battered Wives, and we have, in case you can't see it very clearly, a naked woman who's covered in some sort of batter, maybe pancake batter or something. And here's what it said, the text says. This photo shows why it's no wonder that wife beating has become one of society's stickiest problems. But today's liberated women should have expected this kind of response when they decided that men should do more of the domestic chores like cooking. Still, there's absolutely no excuse for doing something this bad. Now he's going to have to beat her just to smooth out all those lumps. So that was from 1981. Up into, like we see here from Hustler in December of 1990, 2 women jogging, and the cartoon caption reads, "The trouble with rapists is that they're never around when you want them." And then, of course, the ad, I think you can see more, the cartoon you can see more clearly here. You know, if you have been raped or would like to be raped, called Rape Line. So very much explicitly giving the message that women enjoy, that women want to be raped. Another episode from Hustler, it's called the Dream Lover series, and so this is the last picture in that series. This picture is the last in the series, called Dream Lover. At the beginning of the series, the woman is brutally beaten by her, quote, dream man, and then the text reads, "She senses the erotic nature of the humiliation which he subjects her to. After being dragged by her hair to the bathroom, the woman's dream lover experience culminates in the scene shown here, in which she gasps for air after her lover has forcibly submerged her head in the water of a toilet." So this is really important stuff, because I think a lot of us have the idea that the pornography of Playboy and of the 1980s, maybe the 90s, that it was harmless, that it was innocent. But here we see very clearly that it's sending messages of violence, of degradation, of clearly advocating for beating and advocating, promoting rape myth. So there was no innocent good pornography back then. It was very much part of laying a foundation that has led to what we have today. Okay, now the next image I'm going to give you time to check out. If you don't want to, if you can look away if you want. I have covered up the worst part of it, but this is an example of just how far Larry Flynt was willing to go in his brutal depictions of women. Okay, so next slide. So to make sure that it was very clear what he was all about, this 1978 cover of Hustler depicts a woman's body being fed through a meat grinder, and the message is, "We will no longer hang up women like pieces of meat." No, we're not going to hang them up anymore. We're going to grind them up and spit them out for you like hamburger meat. Oh, something's happened. I think we lost the cartoon, but in Larry Flynt, in Hustler, you had the presentation of the character Chester the molester, and as well as others who went about seeking children to molest, and so this was normalized in Hustler magazine, child molestation. Yes, and yet, I mean, it's astounding to me that this man is held up as some icon of freedom, of liberty, and as we see in the film that came out about him. With starring Woody Harrelson, like he's like Larry Flynt is a hero and a martyr for freedom. So what you have when you wrap all this stuff together, you have Kinsey's report, you have the way in which it was normalizing child sexual exploitation, you have Playboy very intentionally, infantilizing women, normalizing child sexual abuse, and of course just engaging in sheer objectification of women. And then you have folks like Buccioni and Flint who relished, who just celebrated and were jubilant and pushing the envelope as far as they could and presenting women in as debased ways as they could. This was this big foundation of pornography that existed for decades. But then what happened was the internet. So you get pornography plus an internet, and you have this atomic effect, this explosion that by now, because what happened, this thing that had been somewhat contained, you had to subscribe, you had to seek it out, you had to go to the adult bookstore, you had to sneak, your dad's pile of pornography hidden away in the barn or under the bed somewhere. Now there wasn't any need to be surreptitious about it anymore. Now pornography could be funneled discreetly into your own home, and it was just a mouse click or two away. So you fast forward, and here we are where we started our conversation, looking at an increasingly pornified world. Now, I was just doing some poking around this week and found out that there's at least 500 different tags that are being used on pornography. So like the tags are what enable people to search for different types of pornography, niches, if you will, genres of porn. And so 500 different types of tags or words that a person might use to search for certain kinds of pornography. And I'm just presenting you a few of the samples here. And so my point being that with what that pornography has undergone an explosion, that it's just gone exponential, and that there's just no, I don't know, they're continually trying to push the frontiers of what is available in pornography. And so, of course, people are going to be creating more coarse, more debased, more bizarre types of pornography in order to get the same effect, because eventually what was once titillating, the effect wears off, and so people go seeking harder, more fringe type of material. And so you end up with 500 different types of tags being used. Now, but beyond the breathtaking sweep of the kinds of pornography that are out there, you have some very common themes and threads that we're going to discuss now. And so, again, as I said in the beginning of this presentation, I apologize for the indecency that's about to follow, but I really have taken pains to, cut away images of bodies, faces, body parts. And so mostly what you're going to just see are words that depict different kinds of pornography, and but they're very disturbing. So here we go. Next. Now, some of these kinds of common pornography, one would be bukkake. And in bukkake pornography, the whole point is that a group of men will gather and ejaculate on a woman's face. So you can, like in this particular film title, 10 Man Cum Slam. So supposedly what will be featured here is a group of 10 men all climaxing and ejaculating on a woman's face. Now, what I want you to see here is that as we move through these, is that there's an intentional debasement going on here that's very clear as we move through these discussions of pornography. And in this one, we see that each girl swallows 10 loads of cum. Next. Another type of pornography that is common, gagging. The intent is to gag the woman. And in this particular, the brutalblowjobs.com, you'll see that they're very clear about what the intention is. Face F her into submission. So it's all about being brutal, it's all about being body punishing, it's all about her debasement. Another one focused on the idea of gagging, this film series, Gag Factor. New whores degraded every Wednesday. Gag on my cock. We F them in the face till they cry. So, does this sound like hate to you? It does to me. Does it sound like propaganda? It does to me. it's clearly trying to debase and dehumanize the people who are performing here. Another common genre, anal penetration, and this one called altered assholes. Next. The text on this one, this is a site called Anal Suffering. It says, "Welcome to analsuffering.com. Nothing makes these sluts hornier and nastier than the pain caused by a huge cock ramming up their tight. For over 3 years, I've been recruiting, filming, and photographing my own amateurs. I've always featured 100% original content that no one else has. I've never sold my content, which means that my members are the only ones I worry about satisfying. Check out my exclusive collection of young teens screaming in anal pain." Next. Here's some more promotional copy for you on this subject. This is from Pure Filth. It says, "We at Pure Filth know exactly what you want, and we're giving it to you. Chicks being ass-effed till their sphincters are pink, puffy, and totally blown out. Adult diapers just might be in store for these whores when their work is done." Another genre is known as ass to mouth. So in this genre of pornography, the man will penetrate her anally and then move to her mouth for oral sex. And the idea is that she has to, quote, eat shit. That's the part of the debasement. That's part of what's turning the men on who use this type of pornography. Double penetration, another common theme in pornography. And a point I really want to make here is that there's, in what you see in pornography is every woman, every type of woman and every type of occupation, any type of life pursuit is being pornified in some fashion. So whether she's a secretary, a teacher, a nurse, a doctor, a maid, a student, a wife, a nanny, a daughter, or a mother, she will be pornified. There's no genre of woman, no category of woman who's safe from the pornographic lens. This is a particularly grotesque example. This is a site called Pimp My Black Teen. And the whole point of it is that they're turning out young black teens into hoes. This is the point of this porn site. So it's a clear link here with the issue of trafficking when we talk about recruiting girls and turning them out into prostitution. That's the whole theme of this porn site. This particular site is all about pornifying babysitters. So all babysitters must be able to change diapers, prepare baby's formula, and give dad some pussy. One of the very common types of pornography that if not the most common, that's searched for is teen porn. So they might be adult performers, but they are chosen and selected specifically because they look so young and innocent and because they don't look their age. And so you can see the titles here. Okay, so this one is Use My Daughter, and this would be an example of turning out one's own daughter for prostitution, or using your daughter to provide commercial sex. And this one, the copy says this: "Use my daughter. Either way, you didn't come here to look at me anyway. You came here to check out my daughter Janessa. She's the slut I pimp out to the guys you see on this site. The first video will explain why exactly I've decided to do this. If you want the short version, it's because I can use the money aside from me loving my booze. I love the extra spending cash I generate from letting these guys F the shit out of my daughter. I don't watch the videos. I'm no freak like that. All I care about is that the little bitch takes care of them so I can get my booze money. I'll update you daily. I'm sure you'll enjoy my collection." So the point of this site is the theme of, purposely, intentionally, a man debasing and prostituting his own daughter. You have incest-themed porn. This one's called Welcome to Daddy's Whore. Natty daughters and their fathers, real incest stories. So sexualization, normalization, promotion of incest as through pornography. And the types of terminology that are used to describe women in pornography are just one slur, one derogatory term after another. And remember back to our discussion of propaganda and how it uses name substitution. I mean, we're not even women. We're not human. We are just things. We are all these things, which I think you can see. So I'm not going to reiterate them, but these, horrible terms like this are what routinely are used to describe women in pornography. Next slide. So, Adolf Hitler said in 1924, propaganda is a truly terrible weapon in the hands of an expert. And I think that Hugh Hefner and Larry Flint and the folks who bring us anal suffering and Daddy's Little Whore, I think they are terrible experts in handling the weapon of propaganda. And a point not to be missed here is that the people who consume this stuff are people that we live and work with all around us. Sometimes they're people we sit next to in church, or the people that we ride the bus and the metro with. They're people who work at the bank, who run for public office. They might even be giving the message at your church this coming Sunday. There might be your doctor, be your lawyer, people who run businesses, advertising executives, people who are teaching your kids, the person that you turn to when you've been a victim of a crime, your law enforcement officer, your kid's soccer coach. The fact is that people all around us are consuming this type of material. And I have to say, sometimes when I think about it, I just want to scream because it's kind of horrible when you think about it, that the guy sitting next to you on the subway, that this guy's probably very likely a porn user, and he's looking at this type of stuff. And how does that mean, what does that mean about how he looks at me or all the other women on the bus, on the subway, or whatever? So we can't expect that people who indulge in consuming this type of material aren't going to have a mindset, a worldview, that their worldview and the way they look at women, the way they look at intimate relationships, it's not going to be changed. It's just crazy. This is the whole, I mean, people go through years of education learning something, like we consume literature, films, books, and theater, all to learn, and it influences who we are as people. So you can't spend hours and days and years consuming this kind of stuff and think it's not going to influence who you are as a person. I think I got a Google there. Yep. Okay. So, so now what? I mean, I've probably just thoroughly depressed you. I'm sorry about that. But the real point of this was just to give you a frame for pornography, of the idea of pornography as propaganda and the types of messages that we're consuming when people use porn. Okay, next. So I have 3 kind of wrap-up points I want us to talk about. So the idea of sexual overconsumption or sexual obesity, as Dr. Marianne Layden has been discussing. And this idea of apathy to everything that's going on, like why don't more people care? Why don't more people see this? And what does this mean about our society and love? So I don't know if you can make out what this picture is, but I think it's pretty gross. And basically what we have here is a giant snake. I think it's like a boa constrictor or a python. I can't remember which. And it has eaten a sheep, an entire sheep. And it's just so huge. And I mean, it's overconsumed so much, it's about to burst. It's just it's just totally disgusting. And I think this is what it is for a lot of people who are currently engaging in pornography consumption. They just keep consuming, and they're consuming this, consuming this horrible, horrible diet of sexualized, debased, horrid, violent content, and they're kind of blowing up inside, kind of like this snake. And really, it's not about. They're really kind of eating from the garbage heap of human relations. It's really sad when there's a banquet to be had. These people are dumpster diving. Okay, so moving on to the idea of apathy. So, I have to apologize, folks. I know this. You're not going to be able to see this quote, so I'm going to have to read it for you. But this is from Andrea Dworkin, and she says this. She says, "The worthlessness of women as human beings is entirely clear when it is understood that pornography is a form of mass entertainment. Pornography is the prostitution of the women in it, and it is a metaphysical definition of all women as whores by nature. So it is also the terror of being born to be used, traded, and sold. The substance of this terror, its details, its ambiance, is the pleasure, is the entertainment for the men who watch it. It is hard to imagine how much they hate us." And I'm using this quote for several reasons. One, I think we've seen clearly in what we've reviewed how pornography defines women as whores by nature. Over and over and over again, the refrain of whore, whore, whore. And we've already talked about how every woman is depicted in that way. So we are born to be used, traded, and sold, at least according to the script of pornography. That's our sole purpose, is to be whore, to be sold, to be bought, to be traded, to be used for some man's sexual pleasure. And then all this debasement that we've just seen, all the horrible examples of pornography that I've just shown you, this is pleasure for people. This is somebody is getting off on that type of thing right now as I'm giving this presentation. Somebody's being entertained by it. And I mean, it just leaves me stunned. Pornography is. It is raw, graphic depictions of hate towards the people who are involved in it. And overwhelmingly, we're talking about depictions of women in debased, horrifying ways, anal suffering. So what is this at its essence except for hate? Okay. So the problem then we have with all this is that we have this saturated culture that's over-consuming itself to death. But the problem is they don't overvalue body and sex. They don't really value it at all. The problem is that they fail to see how valuable the body and sex really are. And that's why they're in the condition that they're in. So, that's weird. We're missing a picture here. Something's happened. But, so if we can contrast then the ideas of what we've seen through this presentation, this, what I would call, what Gail Dines calls making hate, as depicted here, or making love. And we all know there's a difference. I mean, it's as clear as the stone in which the statue is carved. It's as clear as the expression on this woman's face. There's a difference between making love and making hate. There's a difference between intimacy and love and relationship, as what's depicted here, and what people are being sold in pornography. I will skip that. So just a couple closing thoughts. Next. I kind of want us to end, I have no idea who's watching this or why you might be watching it, what your personal experience with pornography might be. But in case you might be somebody who's wrestling with pornography in your life, I want to ask some personal questions, and I hope that you'll be challenged to give it some real serious consideration. So first I want to ask you, is pornography making you a better human being or a worse one? Is there anything about pornography that's making you better? Is there more to life than the messages depicted in pornography? Like, because the impression I'm getting is that the people who get sucked up into this, they're doing it on with great frequency, to the degree that in some cases people lose their marriages, they lose their jobs, it becomes the sole focus of their day is pornography. But isn't there more to life than what porn is selling you? And I also want to ask you, do you want lasting love, or do you want the next vacuous orgasm? I mean, really, I'm just amazed that people are satisfied with these, meaningless orgasm over and over and over. And you have to start, sooner have one than it's time to go start chasing the next one. And that can't be a very fulfilling way to live life, or I don't see how it could be. Life has so much more to offer, and it's so enriched by the relationships that we have, and building deep friendships and lasting relationships with people that we can be truly deeply intimate with and deep knowing, like in marriage. And then lastly, I want to ask, what's your legacy going to be? I think about people like Hugh Hefner, or the Larry Flints of the world, or the people who are producing all this stuff that's out there now. And I'm like, wow, would I want to die and that be my legacy to the world, that I introduced the world to anal suffering? Wow, what a great contribution that would have been. Or, like people like Larry Flint grinding up women like meat. That's his legacy. So I want to just really challenge the folks. I'm not trying to shame you. I just want you to think. And I want to encourage you to seek help and to get resources. There's so many people who are working to provide resources and therapy and ways that you can break your addiction if you're caught up in using porn. So there's hope. As dark as all this is, there really is hope. And that's why we're here. If we didn't think there was hope, we wouldn't be bothering, sending you this message or giving you this presentation. But just think about what your legacy can be, and there's so much more to life, I promise you. So, and we're going to close with a couple of quotes from G.K. Chesterton. I like this one. He says, most modern freedom is at root fear. That's interesting. I don't think people think of freedom as fear. He says, most modern freedom is at root fear. It's not so much that we are too bold to endure rules. It's rather that we are too timid to endure responsibilities. And so my point in sharing this is that, one of the ways in which porn is sold to us is with this idea that, it's all about our freedom, when actually it's about our bondage. They're just packaging it up in a way with lies and deceit to tell us it's about our freedom, when it's really about our debasement and our bondage. And the sad fact is, there are a whole lot of people who are afraid. They're afraid of responsibility. They're afraid of living rightly. They're afraid of anything that would put any encumbrance on them. And they put their individual right, or their supposed right. They're insanely and incredibly selfish individuals who put themselves over the welfare and good of other people. And so again, that kind of ties back into some of the thoughts that we were talking about earlier about hate and love. And I would argue that people who are using pornography are advocating responsibility, and they're definitely not acting in a way that's loving towards the people who care about them. And as I started at the beginning that this isn't going to be a presentation about with the statistics or even giving all the solutions, but I do want to leave us on a more hopeful note. And again, here's a quote from C.K. Chesterton, and he says, "Rational optimism leads to stagnation. It is irrational optimism that leads to reform." Irrational optimism. And so I would say we're in a time in which we need irrational optimism, because when we look around us and we see all this pornification, we see all the sexual degradation and harm and exploitation that's going on all around us, it's very easy to become overwhelmed, to become cynical, and to just want to give up. But when we can maintain some irrational optimism, is we can really make a difference. And I truly believe that all is not lost. We are here at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation working on this stuff every day, and I never cease to be encouraged by the things I hear coming back from the field. Like just yesterday, we got a beautiful email from a man in Uganda who is working there to combat pornography, and he had these beautiful pictures of the time he spent talking to kids at school there, and it just gave me so much hope. And we can't afford to sit back or throw up our hands. There's too many lives at stake, lives of the people that we love. So I just encourage you to be irrational in your optimism and to join with us in the fight against sexual exploitation. Thank you.